I'm Aven Delora, 26 years old. Until 3 weeks ago, I believed family meant sacrifice, that love required giving until it hurt. Then I found a crumpled boarding pass in my sister's jacket pocket, and everything I thought I knew about loyalty shattered. My name was printed on that ticket, to Kyoto, the trip I'd saved 2 years for. But Seliah's handwriting was scrawled across the back with hotel confirmations. For 730 days, I'd worked double shifts, skipped meals, and slept on a mattress on the floor, because every dollar went toward those cherry blossoms I'd dreamed of since childhood. My sister's words still echo in my mind. "You'll have other chances, Aven. I needed this more than you did." What she didn't know was that I had been quietly paying her rent for 6 months while she found herself through another failed art project. How do you forgive someone who steals your dreams and calls it love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mason jar sat on my windowsill like a shrine to delayed gratification. For 2 years, every tip from the late shift diner, every spare $5 bill from the art supply store, every coin I found in coat pockets, it all went into that jar. Leorin used to joke that I treated it like a religious artifact, and maybe I did. Inside was $8,000 in small bills and change, the exact amount I'd calculated for 3 weeks in Kyoto. Flights, a small traditional inn near Kiyomizu-dera Temple, train passes, and enough left over for the watercolor paper I planned to buy from a shop Ezric had told me about. I remember the weight of the jar when I first moved into the apartment with Leorin 2 years ago. Empty then, it felt insignificant. Now, full to the brim, it represented something larger than money. It was proof I could commit to something that mattered to me. Every time I walked past it, I'd imagine sitting in a temple garden, sketching the way morning light filtered through bamboo, finally having the space to think thoughts that belonged only to me. The apartment itself was a study in careful budgeting. Leorin and I had found it in southeast Portland, one of those 1920s buildings with character that landlords called vintage charm to justify the thin walls and temperamental plumbing. But it had huge windows that caught the afternoon light. And the rent was split evenly, something that felt revolutionary after years of being the family safety net. My room was small, just big enough for a twin mattress on the floor, a desk made from a door and 2 sawhorses, and that windowsill where my dreams lived in glass and metal. Leorin had decorated the common areas with their zine collection and plants that somehow thrived despite our irregular schedules. They worked at a coffee shop downtown that actually treated its employees like humans, and in their spare time, they published a monthly zine called Soft Revolt. Stories about people finding quiet ways to reclaim their lives. They'd been trying to get me to submit something for months, but I always insisted I had nothing interesting to say. "Your whole life is interesting," they'd argue while watering the spider plant that hung above our kitchen table. "You just don't see it yet." My days had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings at Meridian Art Supply, where I helped customers choose brushes and explain the difference between student-grade and professional watercolors. The work was peaceful, surrounded by the smell of paper and the soft conversations of people planning creative projects. Ezric worked there too, manning the register with a quiet efficiency that made even difficult customers leave feeling heard. He was finishing his graphic design degree at Portland State and had a way of listening that made you forget you were talking to someone you'd only known for 8 months. Evenings meant the diner, a 24-hour place called Murphy's that served comfort food to insomniacs, night shift workers, and people who needed somewhere warm to sit when the world felt too cold. The tips weren't spectacular, but they were consistent, and the late-night crowd had a camaraderie that made the work bearable. Plus, the owner let me sketch during slow periods, as long as I kept the coffee flowing and the customers happy. This routine had become my sanctuary. For the first time in my adult life, nobody was depending on me to fix their crisis or cover their rent. I wasn't getting phone calls at midnight asking me to pick someone up from a bar or listen to a 3-hour monologue about why their latest project was misunderstood by the world. It was just me, my 2 jobs, and the growing weight of possibility in that mason jar. I'd spent hours planning the trip, researching neighborhoods in Kyoto where I could walk through bamboo groves and visit temples without fighting crowds. I wanted to see the places where centuries of people had come seeking peace, to sit in gardens designed to help you find your center. I'd imagined writing in small notebooks, sketching the details that caught my eye, finally having conversations with myself without interruption. The planning had become its own ritual. Every Sunday morning, I'd sit at my makeshift desk with a cup of coffee and my laptop, reading travel blogs and studying maps. I'd learned about the philosophical gardens of Ryuan-ji, where 15 stones were arranged so that you could never see all of them from any single vantage point. I'd bookmarked articles about the cherry blossom season, when the whole city paused to appreciate beauty that lasted only days. I'd even started learning basic Japanese phrases, practicing them quietly while I walked to work. Leorin had watched this planning with a mixture of pride and concern. "You know it's okay to want things just for yourself, right?" they'd said one evening, finding me hunched over my laptop with a notebook full of temple visiting hours. "You don't have to justify this trip to anyone. You don't have to earn the right to take care of yourself." But earning felt like the only language I knew. Growing up in our house meant proving your worth through service, showing love through sacrifice. My parents had divorced when I was 15, and Seliah was 20, and somehow I'd become the designated fixer, the one who smoothed conflicts and absorbed everyone else's emotional overflow. When Seliah dropped out of art school for the second time, I'd helped her move. When she decided to start a jewelry business that folded after 3 months, I'd bought supplies I couldn't afford. When she needed someone to listen while she processed her latest heartbreak or creative block, I'd made myself available at any hour. The pattern had followed us into adulthood. Even after I moved out, Seliah would call with emergencies that required my immediate attention. Car trouble that needed my 8AA membership. Rent that came due when her commissions fell through. Emotional crises that demanded hours of careful listening and validation. I'd told myself this was what family meant, showing up even when it cost you. But lately, something had shifted. Maybe it was the accumulating weight in the mason jar, the tangible proof that I could build something for myself. Maybe it was watching Leorin create boundaries that somehow made their relationships stronger, not weaker. Or maybe it was the quiet conversations with Ezric, who had a way of asking questions that made me examine my own assumptions. "What would happen if you said no?" he'd asked one afternoon when I'd mentioned canceling our plans because Seliah needed help moving again. The question had startled me, not because it was harsh, but because it had never occurred to me that no was an option. The Japan Fund, as Leorin had nicknamed it, represented my first real attempt at putting myself first. Every dollar that went into that jar was a dollar that didn't go toward fixing someone else's emergency. Every day I chose to save instead of spend was a small act of faith that my dreams mattered as much as anyone else's needs. I'd been planning to book the flights the following week. The cherry blossom forecast looked perfect for early April, and I'd found a small ryokan with traditional tatami rooms and a garden where guests could sit with morning tea. The owner had responded to my inquiry in careful English, welcoming me to experience the quiet season when the crowds thinned and the temples returned to their contemplative purpose. 3 weeks. 3 weeks until I would board a plane with my sketchbooks and my carefully planned itinerary. 3 weeks until I would sit in a garden on the other side of the world and finally have conversations with myself without interruption. I should have known that Seliah would find a way to need something right before I was about to put myself first. The knock came at 7:30 on a Thursday morning, sharp and insistent in the way that meant trouble. I was getting ready for my shift at Meridian, my hair still damp from the shower, when I heard Celia's voice through the door. "Aven, I know you're in there. I can hear you moving around." I opened the door to find my sister looking like she'd been up all night. Mascara smudged, her dark hair escaping from what had probably started as a neat bun, wearing the red leather jacket she'd bought during her brief stint as a vintage clothing reseller. She had a suitcase at her feet and that particular energy she got when she was running from something. "I need to crash here for a few days," she announced, pushing past me into the apartment. "Marcus turned out to be a complete psycho, and I can't go back to that place." Marcus was the latest in a series of boyfriends who had seemed perfect until they weren't. Musician, artist, entrepreneur. Seliah had a pattern of falling for men who promised to understand her creative soul and then revealed themselves to be users, manipulators, or just garden-variety immature. This one had lasted longer than most, almost 6 months, and I'd started to hope he might be different. "What happened?" I asked, closing the door and automatically switching into crisis management mode. "He's been stealing from me," she said, dropping onto our couch with the dramatic flair that punctuated all of Seliah's stories. "Money from my wallet, jewelry, even some of my paintings. I confronted him last night and he completely lost it. Started screaming about how I was paranoid and ungrateful." She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of increasingly unhinged text messages. "Look at this. He's completely unraveling." I read through the messages, feeling that familiar combination of protective anger and weary resignation. This was what Seliah's relationships always became. Intense passion followed by spectacular implosion, leaving her emotionally and often financially devastated. "Of course you can stay here," I said, because what else could I say? "But Lioren's at work and I need to leave for my shift in 20 minutes. We can talk more tonight." "You're an angel," Seliah said, and I felt that old familiar warmth, the pleasure of being needed and appreciated. I knew I could count on you. Lioren came home that evening to find Seliah arranged across our couch like she was posing for a melancholy photo shoot, surrounded by the contents of her suitcase. Vintage dresses, art supplies, jewelry, books of poetry, and the detritus of someone who treated possessions like emotional totems. "Hey, Seliah," Lioren said carefully, setting down their messenger bag. They'd met my sister enough times to recognize the signs of a Seliah crisis event. "Lioren." Seliah brightened, sitting up and arranging herself more conventionally. "I hope you don't mind me crashing here for a bit. I'm having a Marcus situation." "Ah," Lioren said, in the tone of someone who'd heard about several Marcus-equivalent situations. "How long is a bit?" "Just until I figure out my next move," Seliah said vaguely. "Maybe a week or 2? I need to find a new place and get some distance from the whole toxic situation." I saw Lioren's eyes flick toward me, reading the resignation in my posture. We'd talked about this pattern before, how Seliah's crises always seemed to coincide with moments when I was finally gaining momentum. In my own life, that night, after Seliah had claimed our couch and fallen asleep watching Netflix, Lioren and I had a quiet conversation in my room. "You know she's going to try to stay longer than 2 weeks," Lioren said, sitting cross-legged on my mattress. "I know," I said, "but she really didn't have anywhere else to go." "Did you ask her about other options? Friends, other family?" I hadn't, because asking would have implied that I didn't want to help. And Seliah had a way of making such implications feel like moral failures. Instead, I'd automatically opened my home and rearranged my life to accommodate her emergency. "She's my sister," I said, which was both an explanation and an admission of defeat. Lioren nodded, understanding the weight of family obligations, even when they disagreed with how I handled them. "Just remember that you have plans too, important ones." But Seliah was good at making her presence feel temporary, even when it wasn't. She kept her belongings in suitcases, talked constantly about apartments she was planning to look at, and made herself useful around the house. She cooked elaborate dinners that left our kitchen looking like a culinary crime scene, but filled the apartment with the smell of garlic and herbs. She bought wine and insisted we have sister bonding time, where she'd tell stories about her latest artistic inspirations and ask about my work at the art store. She was also struggling in ways that felt deeper than usual. The Marcus situation had shaken her confidence, and she spent hours on the phone with friends dissecting every detail of the relationship, trying to understand how she'd missed the red flags. She'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd hear her moving around the living room, restless with anxiety and creative energy. I keep thinking I should be better at this by now, she confessed one evening when we were cleaning up after another elaborate dinner. Reading people, choosing partners, building a life that actually works. I'm 31, Aven. Shouldn't I have figured this out? It was one of the few moments when Seliah's vulnerability felt genuine rather than performative, and I felt that old protective instinct surge up. This was why I couldn't just turn her away. Underneath all the drama and self-centeredness was someone genuinely trying to find her way in the world. 2 weeks stretched into 3, then 4. Seliah's apartment search became increasingly half-hearted, her mentions of moving out more vague. She'd found a part-time job at a gallery downtown, but the pay was minimal, and she'd started making comments about how expensive Portland had become, how impossible it was to find decent housing on an artist's income. I found myself covering more of the groceries, doing more of the household tasks, accommodating her late-night creative sessions and morning sleep-ins. The rhythms of the apartment shifted around her presence, louder, more chaotic, but also more alive in ways that made me question whether I'd been living too quietly. Meanwhile, my trip planning had stalled. The cherry blossom season was approaching, and I needed to book flights soon, or risk losing the small window of perfect timing I'd researched so carefully. But every time I sat down with my laptop, Seliah would need to process some new development. In her recovery from Marcus, or she'd want to show me her latest paintings, or she'd suggest we watch a movie together. "You seem distracted lately," Ezric observed one afternoon at the art store. "Everything okay?" I was reorganizing the watercolor display for the 3rd time that week, trying to work through the low-level anxiety that had become my constant companion. My sister's staying with us while she figures out her living situation. It's just a lot. Ezric nodded, understanding the weight of family complexity. His own grandparents had raised him, and he'd told me stories about navigating the expectations and obligations that came with being someone's primary source of stability. "Are you still planning your trip?" he asked. The question hit me harder than it should have. I'd been avoiding thinking about the trip directly, telling myself I was just waiting for the right moment to finalize the plans. But the truth was that every day Seliah stayed made it harder to imagine leaving. "I don't know," I admitted. "The timing might not be right anymore." Ezric was quiet for a moment, then said something that stayed with me. "Sometimes the timing is never going to feel right. Sometimes you have to decide what matters more, waiting for permission or giving it to yourself." That night, I sat at my desk with my laptop open to the airline website, my finger hovering over the purchase button. The flights were still available, the ryokan still had rooms, and my savings jar still held enough to make it real. All I had to do was click. But from the living room, I could hear Seliah on the phone with another friend, her voice carrying the particular strain of someone trying to hold herself together. In a few hours, she'd probably want to debrief the conversation, to talk through whatever new insight or anxiety had emerged. And I'd listen, because that's what I always did. I closed the laptop without booking the flight. 3 days later, I found the boarding pass in her jacket pocket, and everything changed. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that, because what happened next changed everything. And I need you to understand that I didn't go looking for betrayal. I was doing laundry, a load of darks that included some of Seliah's clothes she'd left scattered around the living room. The red leather jacket was draped over the back of a chair, and I'd learned from experience that Seliah left important things in pockets: earrings, lip gloss, crumpled receipts, the occasional $20 bill. So I checked the pockets before throwing the jacket in the wash. Standard procedure. The first pocket held nothing unusual: a hair tie, some loose change, a receipt from the gallery where she worked. But the inner pocket, the hidden one she probably thought I didn't know about, contained a folded piece of paper. That made my heart stop. It was a boarding pass. Delta Airlines, Portland to Seattle, to Tokyo to Osaka. Departure date, March 15th. That was next week. The name on the pass was mine, Aven Delora, but the handwriting on the back was unmistakably Seliah's flowing script. Hotel confirmations for Kyoto. The same ryokan I'd bookmarked. The traditional inn with the garden where I'd planned to drink. Morning tea, and sketch the way light moved through bamboo. Seliah had written out the confirmation number in her distinctive purple ink, along with notes about train schedules and temple visiting hours. My hands were shaking as I unfolded the paper completely. There, in Seliah's handwriting, was my entire itinerary. Every temple I'd researched, every garden I'd dreamed of visiting, every carefully planned detail of the trip that was supposed to be mine. She'd even copied down the address of the art supply shop Ezric had recommended, where I'd planned to buy traditional watercolor paper. I stood in our kitchen holding the evidence of something I couldn't quite name. Theft seemed too small a word. This wasn't just about money or even about a vacation. This was about the careful architecture of dreams, the meticulous construction of hope, the patient accumulation of possibility, all of it hijacked and claimed by someone who had never learned to build anything for herself. The apartment felt different suddenly, like the walls had shifted when I wasn't looking. I walked to my room and stared at the mason jar on the windowsill. It was still there, still full, but somehow it looked smaller now, more vulnerable. $8,000 in small bills and change, each one representing a choice to believe in my own worth. I heard the front door open and Seliah's voice calling out, "Aven, are you home? I brought Thai food." For a moment, I considered confronting her immediately, demanding an explanation while the evidence was still in my hands. But something held me back. Maybe the ingrained habit of avoiding conflict, or maybe the deeper need to understand the scope of what had been taken from me. "I'm in my room," I called back, slipping the boarding pass into my desk drawer. "I'll be out in a minute." I found Seliah in the kitchen, unpacking containers of pad thai and green curry with the enthusiasm of someone who'd had a good day. She was wearing a vintage dress I'd seen her claim from various ex-boyfriends' closets over the years, and her hair was arranged in the effortless way that actually took considerable effort. I had the most amazing conversation with the gallery owner. "Today," she said, not looking up from the food, "she thinks my mixed media pieces might be perfect for this show she's curating about transformation and renewal. Can you believe it? Finally, someone who understands what I'm trying to do with my art." I watched her arrange the food on our mismatched plates, chattering about the gallery owner's vision and the other artists who might be included in the show. She seemed genuinely excited, more animated than I'd seen her since the Marcus situation imploded. Under different circumstances, I might have been happy for her. "That sounds great," I managed to say, taking the plate she handed me. "I'm thinking of calling the series Borrowed Light," she continued, settling onto the couch and tucking her legs under herself. "The idea is that we're all reflecting experiences that aren't originally ours, finding beauty in the aftermath of what other people have created." The irony was so sharp it made me dizzy. I sat across from her, pushing pad thai around my plate while she talked about borrowed light and reflected experiences, the boarding pass burning in my desk drawer like a piece of evidence in a crime. I was still trying to understand. "You're quiet tonight," Seliah observed after a few minutes. "Is everything okay?" "Just tired," I said. "Long day at the store." She nodded sympathetically. "You work too hard, you know that? You should take a break sometime. Do something just for yourself." The casual cruelty of the comment hit me like a physical blow. Here was someone who had apparently stolen my carefully planned break, my chance to do something just for myself, offering advice about self-care with the same tone she might use to comment on the weather. "Actually," I said, testing the waters, "I've been thinking about taking that trip to Japan. Remember the one I've been saving for?" Seliah's fork paused, halfway to her mouth, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, panic, defiance. But she recovered quickly, setting down her fork and turning toward me with concerned attention. "Oh, Aven, I don't think now is the best time for that," she said gently. You've been so stressed lately, and traveling alone when you're already feeling overwhelmed. It might not be the healthiest choice." "What do you mean overwhelmed?" I asked. "You know, with work and everything. Plus, I might need your help figuring out this housing situation. I don't want to be a burden, but the rental market is just impossible right now." She was doing it again. The subtle redirection, the way she could take any conversation about my needs and transform it into a discussion of her circumstances. But now I knew it wasn't just emotional manipulation. It was covering up active theft. "The cherry blossoms will be perfect in early April," I said, watching her face carefully. "I've been researching the timing for months. Cherry blossoms happen every year," Seliah said with a little laugh. "They'll still be there next year, or the year after. But family is here now, and we need to take care of each other." That night, after Seliah had fallen asleep on the couch, I sat at my desk and stared at the boarding pass. The departure date was March 15th, 6 days away. Which meant she'd been planning this for weeks, maybe longer. The hotel reservations had been made 2 weeks ago, according to the confirmation number. She'd been living in my apartment, eating my food, accepting my emotional support, all while secretly planning to steal the trip I'd spent 2 years saving for. I opened my laptop and checked my savings account. $8,000, still untouched. Whatever she'd used to pay for the trip, it hadn't come from my carefully accumulated fund. But that almost made it worse. It meant she had access to money she could have used to find her own apartment, to build her own life. But instead, she'd chosen to take mine. The worst part was how perfectly she'd copied my plans. Every detail I'd shared with her during those long evening conversations, every temple I'd mentioned wanting to visit, every carefully researched recommendation. She'd been taking notes, building her own version of my dream. I thought about calling Leorin, but they were working a late shift at the coffee shop and wouldn't be home until after midnight. I thought about confronting Seliah immediately, but some instinct told me to wait, to gather my thoughts and figure out what I actually wanted to say. So I sat there with the evidence in my hands, feeling something crack open inside my chest. Not just anger, though that was there too. Something deeper. The recognition that I had been complicit in my own erasure, that my desire to be good and generous and understanding had made me an easy target for someone who saw kindness as weakness. For 2 years, I'd been careful with every dollar, deliberate with every choice, patient with every sacrifice. I'd worked double shifts and skipped meals and slept on a mattress on the floor, because I believed that discipline and dedication would eventually pay off. I'd trusted that if I just waited long enough, saved enough, planned carefully enough, I would finally get to put myself first. But Seliah didn't believe in waiting. She believed in taking what she needed when she needed it, and if that meant taking it from someone else, well, that was just how the world worked. The strong took from the weak, the bold took from the patient, and those who hesitated lost out to those who acted. I'd always admired her confidence, the way she moved through the world as if she deserved good things to happen to her. Now, I was beginning to understand that her confidence came at a cost, specifically, at the cost of people like me, people who'd been trained to give until it hurt and call it love. The boarding pass felt heavy in my hands, heavier than paper should be. It was proof of something I'd suspected but never wanted to acknowledge, that my sister saw my dreams as raw material for her own life, my carefully constructed plans as resources to be harvested when convenient. 6 days. In 6 days, Seliah would board a plane using my name and live my carefully researched dream while I stayed home and wondered what had happened to my life, unless I decided to stop her. The photograph was tucked inside my old journal, the one I'd kept in high school when writing felt like the only way to make sense of the world. Seliah and me at ages 8 and 13, sharing a strawberry ice cream cone on the boardwalk at Cannon Beach. Her arm was around my shoulders, both of us squinting into the camera with genuine smiles, our hair whipped by ocean wind into identical tangles. I'd found it while looking for something else, anything else, to help me understand how we'd gotten from there to here. From shared ice cream to stolen dreams. Looking at that photograph now, I could almost remember what it felt like to trust her completely. Seliah had been my hero then, 5 years older and infinitely more sophisticated, the one who taught me how to braid friendship bracelets and sneak cookies from the kitchen after bedtime. She'd been the one who held me during thunderstorms and explained why our parents fought in voices that carried through thin walls. But even then, there had been signs. The way she'd eat more than half of any shared treat, always with a charming smile and a logical explanation. The way she'd borrow my favorite sweater and somehow forget to return it until I'd outgrown it. The way she'd use my homework as inspiration for her own projects, always with the disclaimer that she was just building on my ideas. I'd thought it was normal sister behavior, the natural dynamic between someone older and more confident and someone younger and eager to please. I'd felt proud to be useful to her, honored that she trusted me enough to share her problems and ask for help. Now I wondered when helping had become enabling, when love had become transaction. The morning after I found the boarding pass, I called in sick to both jobs, something I'd never done unless I was actually bedridden with fever. I needed time to think, to understand the scope of what was happening and decide what I wanted to do about it. Seliah had left early for her gallery job, kissing my forehead and promising to bring home groceries. The gesture felt different now, loaded with the knowledge of what she was planning. Was she being extra affectionate because she felt guilty? Or was this just how she operated, compartmentalizing her deception so completely that she could steal from me and care for me simultaneously? I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, determined to understand exactly what she'd taken. The boarding pass was just the beginning. I needed to see the full scope of the theft. Her email was logged in on my laptop from the last time she'd used it to apply for jobs. I hesitated for a moment, understanding that reading someone else's email crossed a line I'd never crossed before. But she'd already crossed a much bigger line, and I needed to know what I was dealing with. The flight confirmation was there, dated 3 weeks ago. She'd used my passport information, my frequent flyer number, my carefully maintained credit score to book flights I'd researched and planned. But the payment had come from an account I didn't recognize. Apparently, she'd had money all along. Money she could have used to find her own apartment instead of camping on my couch for over a month. The hotel reservations were even more detailed than what I'd seen on the handwritten note. She'd booked the exact room I'd inquired about, the one that faced the garden where centuries of travelers had come seeking peace. She'd even arranged for the traditional breakfast service I'd specifically asked about, the one where they brought tea and rice to your room at sunrise. But the worst discovery was in her sent folder, emails to friends describing her upcoming trip to Japan. She'd written to people I didn't even know, sharing her excitement about visiting temples and cherry blossoms, describing the spiritual journey she was planning to take. She'd stolen not just my trip, but my language for explaining why it mattered. "I've been saving for this for so long," she'd written to someone named Miranda. "It's going to be exactly what I need to reset and find my center again. Sometimes you have to invest in your own healing, you know?" I stared at those words until they blurred. She'd taken my months of research, my careful budgeting, my patient saving, and my philosophical reasons for needing this trip, and she'd packaged them as her own inspiration. She'd stolen not just the external experience, but the internal narrative that made it meaningful. My phone buzzed with a text from Lioren. "How are you feeling? Soup delivery possible if needed." I'd told them I was sick when I'd texted about calling in to work, but the lie felt transparent now. Lioren knew me well enough to recognize the difference between physical illness and emotional crisis. "Can you come home early today?" I texted back. "I need to talk to you about something." "On my way," they replied immediately. Lioren arrived, 40 minutes later, with soup from the place down the street and the kind of focused attention they brought to real emergencies. They took one look at my face and set the soup aside. What happened? I showed them the boarding pass, the email confirmations, the trail of theft and deception that Seliah had left scattered across my laptop. Leorin read through everything twice, their expression growing darker with each new detail. She used your passport information, they said finally. That's not just stealing a trip, Aven. That's identity theft. I hadn't thought of it in legal terms, but hearing Leorin say it out loud made the scope of the violation clear. This wasn't just about money or even about the experience I'd lose. Seliah had literally stolen my identity to live a life I'd designed for myself. What are you going to do? Leorin asked. It was the question I'd been avoiding all morning. What could I do? Confront her and demand she cancel the trip? Report her to the airline for fraudulent use of my information? Cut off contact and let her go to Japan with my name and my dreams? I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to pretend I never found out. Let her have the trip and just save up for another one. Leorin's expression was gentle but firm. And the other part? The other part wants to burn everything down. We sat in silence for a moment, both understanding that this was about more than a vacation. This was about a lifetime of small thefts and quiet erasures of putting myself last and calling it virtue. She's leaving in 5 days, I said. March 15th, which gives you 5 days to decide who you want to be when this is over, Leorin said. The person who lets this happen, or the person who says no. That afternoon, I walked through southeast Portland with no particular destination, just needing to move while my thoughts sorted themselves. I found myself in Laurelhurst Park, sitting on a bench near the pond where families brought their children to feed ducks. I watched a mother teaching her daughter to throw bread pieces, showing her how to make them small enough for the ducks to swallow safely. The daughter, maybe 5 years old, was generous with the bread, but kept the biggest pieces for herself. Natural and healthy, she understood that taking care of others didn't require depleting yourself. When had I learned the opposite? When had I started believing that love meant giving until it hurt, that family loyalty required accepting whatever treatment was offered? I thought about the photograph of Seliah and me sharing ice cream, and suddenly I remembered something I'd forgotten. After that picture was taken, we'd gone to the gift shop and our parents had given us each $5 to spend. I'd bought a small seashell necklace that cost exactly $5. Seliah had found a sand dollar decoration that cost $8, and when she didn't have enough money, I'd given her the $3 she needed. I'd felt good about it then, proud to help my big sister get something she really wanted. But I'd never gotten anything for myself that day, and Seliah had never offered to share or help me find something I could afford with the money I had left. Even at 8 years old, I'd been learning to make myself smaller so she could expand. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The pattern had followed us through childhood, through adolescence, into adulthood. Seliah taking the bigger portion, the better opportunity, the more interesting experience, while I learned to find satisfaction in being helpful, being generous, being good. But somewhere along the way, being good had become being invisible. Being generous had become being used. And Seliah had learned that my love was a resource she could harvest whenever she needed it, consequence-free. My phone buzzed with a text from Ezric. Hope you're feeling better. Saved you a sample of the new watercolor paper that came in, the kind made from bamboo fiber. The gesture was small but thoughtful, exactly the kind of attention that made me feel seen rather than useful. Ezric had never asked me to fix his problems or absorb his emotional overflow. He just noticed things. When I was excited about a new art technique, when I was stressed about work, when I needed space to figure things out. I texted back, "Thank you, that's really sweet." "Want to grab coffee later this week?" he replied. "I'm curious about how the trip planning is going." The trip planning, right. The trip that was happening in 5 days, just not with me on it. I stared at his message for a long moment, then typed, I need to tell you something about that. Sitting in the park, watching families feed ducks and couples walk hand in hand along the paths, I began to understand what Leorin had meant about deciding who I wanted to be. I could remain the person who absorbed other people's choices and called it love, or I could become someone who believed her own dreams were worth protecting. The photograph in my journal showed two sisters sharing ice cream, but it didn't show what happened next. One sister learning to take, the other learning to give, until the dynamic became so entrenched that neither of them questioned it anymore. But patterns could be broken. Even old ones. Even ones that felt like love. Even ones that had been years in the making. I had 5 days to decide if I was ready to break this one. The letter was wedged between pages 247 and 248 of my copy of The Artist's Way, a book Leorin had given me months ago with the inscription, "For when you're ready to stop asking permission to create." I'd started reading it twice but never finished, always finding reasons to put it aside when it got too close to truths I wasn't ready to face. The letter was in my handwriting, dated 6 months ago, around the time Seliah had first started having problems with Marcus. Dear Seliah, I need to tell you something I've never been able to say out loud. I love you, but I don't like who I become when you need me. I become smaller, quieter, less myself. I start measuring my worth by how useful I can be to you, how much I can give without asking for anything back. I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately, about how she used to say that family means sacrifice. But I think she got it wrong. I think family is supposed to mean that everyone gets to exist fully, that love doesn't require erasure. I'm tired, Seliah. I'm tired of being the repository for your emergencies and your emotional overflow. I'm tired of having conversations that center entirely on your experiences, while mine get relegated to brief intermissions. I'm tired of feeling guilty for wanting things for myself. I don't think you mean to do this. I think you're just doing what you've always done, what worked for you when we were kids. But we're not kids anymore, and I can't keep being the little sister who gives you the bigger half of everything. I'm going to Japan in April. I've been saving for 2 years, and it's the first thing I've ever planned that belongs entirely to me. I need you to know that this trip is not negotiable, not shareable, not available for you to need more than I do. I hope you can understand. Love. Aven. I had no memory of writing this letter, but here it was in my careful handwriting, evidence of a moment 6 months ago when I'd been brave enough to name what was happening between us. Why hadn't I sent it? What had stopped me from having the conversation I'd clearly been building toward? Then I remembered. The day after I'd written this letter, Seliah had called in tears because Marcus had stood her up for an important gallery opening. She'd spent hours getting ready, had invited friends to meet her there, and then he'd texted at the last minute with some excuse about band practice. She'd been humiliated and heartbroken, and I'd spent 3 hours on the phone helping her process the disappointment. By the time that crisis had passed, the letter had felt cruel and selfish. How could I set boundaries with someone who was already struggling? How could I prioritize my own needs when she was clearly falling apart? So I'd tucked the letter away and told myself I'd revisit the conversation when she was in a better place. But there had always been another crisis, another heartbreak, another reason why it wasn't the right time to ask for space or consideration. Now, reading my own words 6 months later, I felt a strange combination of pride and grief. Pride that I'd been capable of such clarity, even if only in private. Grief for the 6 months I'd lost, the boundaries I hadn't set, the trip that was now being stolen from me. It was Wednesday. Celia's flight was scheduled for Friday morning. 2 days to decide whether I was finally ready to send a letter I should have sent months ago. I found her that evening in our kitchen, painting her nails a deep burgundy color while talking on the phone with someone about the gallery show she was hoping to be included in. She looked up when I walked in, holding up one hand to show me the color. "What do you think?" she mouthed, wiggling her fingers. "Pretty," I said, though the word felt strange in my mouth. She finished her call and capped the nail polish with a satisfied expression. "I'm thinking of calling in sick tomorrow," she said. "I want to get my portfolio together for this exhibition. The deadline is next week, and I really think this could be my breakthrough moment." Tomorrow was Thursday. Her flight was Friday morning, which meant she was planning to spend her last day in Portland working on art applications instead of, say, packing for the trip she'd stolen from me. The casual way she mentioned calling in sick, something I'd done exactly twice in my adult life, both times with actual fevers, made me understand something about the difference between us. Seliah didn't see jobs as obligations or commitments. She saw them as conveniences that existed to support her real life, her real priorities. If she needed a day to work on art, she took it. If she needed money, she found someone to provide it. If she needed a trip to Japan, she took one. "Actually," I said, "I was hoping we could talk tomorrow evening about some things that have been on my mind." She looked up from examining her nails, and I saw that flicker of wariness again, the same expression she'd had when I'd mentioned my Japan trip. "Of course," she said. "Is everything okay? You've seemed kind of tense lately." "I'm fine," I said. "I just think it's time we had a conversation about some things." "Mysterious," she said with a laugh that sounded forced. "Should I be worried?" "No," I said, though that wasn't entirely true. "Just honest. That night I sat at my desk and wrote a new letter. Not the careful diplomatic version I might have written 6 months ago, but something clearer and more direct. Seliah, I found the boarding pass in your jacket pocket. I know about the trip, about the hotel reservations, about the emails you sent to friends describing it as your own spiritual journey. I need you to understand what you've taken. It's not just a vacation. It's 2 years of double shifts and skipped meals. It's every dollar I didn't spend on new clothes or dinners out or spontaneous fun. It's the first time in my adult life I've planned something entirely for myself. You've been staying on my couch for over a month, eating food I bought, accepting emotional support I freely gave, all while planning to steal the one thing I've ever saved for. You used my passport information, my research, my carefully planned itinerary. You even copied my reasons for why the trip mattered. I know you think I'll forgive this, the way I've forgiven everything else. I know you think my love is unconditional, that family loyalty means accepting whatever treatment you decide to give me, but I'm not the 8-year-old who gave you her ice cream money anymore. I'm not the teenager who covered for you when you broke curfew. I'm not the young adult who helped you move every time another relationship fell apart. I'm someone who worked 2 jobs for 2 years to save for a dream, and you're not taking it from me. Cancel the trip, or I will. Aven I folded the letter carefully and put it in an envelope with her name on it. Tomorrow evening, after she'd spent the day working on her portfolio and making plans for a future built on stolen foundations, I would give it to her. But first, I had some calls to make. I started with the airline. It took 3 transfers and 40 minutes on hold, but I finally reached a customer service representative who could help me report fraudulent use of my passport information. They took down the details and assured me they would flag the reservation for review. This happens more often than you'd think, the representative told me. Family members assuming they can use each other's identification, but it's a serious federal offense. Next, I called the ryokan in Kyoto. The time difference meant it was morning there, and the owner answered in careful English. I explained that someone had made a reservation using my name without permission, and asked if it could be canceled. "Ah," he said, and I could hear the disappointment in his voice. "This is a very sad situation. The room was prepared specially for the guest, who wrote such thoughtful emails about seeking peace in the garden. Those thoughtful emails had been Seliah's, based on my research and desires but written in her voice. Even my genuine interest in the cultural experience had been filtered through her interpretation of what I wanted. I am still interested in visiting, I said carefully. But in April, for the cherry blossom season, if you have availability. For original guest who wrote with such respect for tradition. Of course we find room. Cherry blossom time is much better for contemplation anyway. Too many tourists in March. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment, realizing that I'd just done something I'd never done before. I'd advocated for myself. I'd taken action to protect something that mattered to me instead of just accepting that it was lost. It felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure. My phone buzzed with a text from Ezric. "That coffee conversation? Want to make it tonight? I'm curious about this thing you needed to tell me." I looked at the letter on my desk, at the evidence of theft spread across my laptop screen, at the old photograph of two sisters sharing ice cream. Tomorrow would be Thursday. Friday morning, Seliah would either board a plane to live my dream, or she would face the consequences of trying to steal it. "Yes," I texted back. "I definitely want to talk tonight." It was time to start saying the things I'd been too afraid to say, to the people who deserved to hear them and to myself most of all. The coffee shop where I met Ezric was one of those Portland institutions that survived on atmosphere and loyalty rather than foot traffic, dim lighting, mismatched furniture, and the kind of acoustic that made every conversation feel intimate, even when you were discussing mundane things. We'd been here before, usually after work when we needed to decompress from particularly difficult customers or complicated art supply emergencies, but tonight felt different. I carried the weight of my discoveries and decisions, and Ezric seemed to sense the shift in my energy before I said anything. "You look like someone who's been wrestling with something important," he said, after we'd settled into our usual corner booth with our drinks. Lavender latte for me, simple black coffee for him. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photograph of the boarding pass. "My sister stole my trip to Japan. She's leaving on Friday morning." Ezric studied the image for a long moment, his expression growing more serious as he absorbed the details. "She used your name?" "Everything. My passport information, my itinerary, my hotel reservations. She's been planning this for weeks while staying on my couch and accepting my help." I told him the whole story, finding the boarding pass, discovering the emails, realizing the scope of what had been taken. Ezric listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped me understand my own narrative better. "What are you going to do?" he asked when I finished. I already called the airline and reported the fraudulent use of my passport. I called the hotel and rescheduled for April, during cherry blossom season. Tomorrow evening, I'm giving her a letter explaining what I know and asking her to cancel the trip. And if she doesn't? I'd been avoiding that question, but sitting across from Ezric in the warm light of the coffee shop, it didn't feel as scary to consider. Then I'll report it as identity theft. I'll let the airline security deal with her when she tries to board the plane. Ezric nodded slowly. "That's a big step." "It is," I admitted. "But I think I've been taking small steps for so long that they've added up to me disappearing." He reached across the table and touched my hand briefly, a gesture of support. That felt more intimate than anything we'd shared before. "I've been wondering when you were going to get angry." "What do you mean?" "You tell these stories about your family, about all the ways they take advantage of your kindness, and you always end them with some version of, 'But that's just how they are.' I kept waiting for you to get mad about it." I thought about the letter I'd written 6 months ago and never sent, about all the conversations I'd avoided and boundaries I'd failed to set. I think I was afraid that if I got angry, I'd lose them completely. And now I'm wondering if I ever really had them, or if I just had the version of myself that was useful to them. We talked for 2 more hours, about family dynamics and personal boundaries and the difference between being loving and being available for exploitation. Ezric told me about his own experience setting limits with relatives who saw his quiet nature as an invitation to dump their problems on him. "My grandmother always said that the people who really love you want to see you whole, not just helpful," he said as we prepared to leave. "The ones who get angry when you start taking care of yourself were never really your family anyway." Walking home through Southeast Portland, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. the sensation of taking up my full amount of space in the world. Not expanding into someone else's territory, but simply refusing to compress myself to accommodate their needs. I found Seliah in our living room, surrounded by art supplies and portfolio pieces, working on her exhibition submission by the light of 3 different lamps. She looked up when I walked in, paint smudged on her cheek, and that particular intensity she got when she was in full creative mode. "How was your coffee date?" she asked with a teasing smile. "Ezric is cute, by the way. Very artistic, sensitive guy energy." The casual way she turned our conversation into gossip about my personal life struck me as another example of how she made herself the center of every narrative. Even my developing relationship with Ezric became raw material for her entertainment. "We're getting to know each other," I said neutrally. "I'm so glad you're putting yourself out there," she said, turning back to her painting. "You've been so focused on work and saving money, I was worried you were turning into a hermit." The irony was breathtaking. Here was someone who had spent over a month living off my generosity while planning to steal my dreams, expressing concern about my social life. "Actually," I said, "I've been thinking a lot about balance lately, about what it means to put myself first sometimes." Seliah glanced up from her painting, and I saw that familiar wariness cross her expression. "That's good," she said carefully. "Self-care is important. I'm learning that self-care sometimes means saying no to people you love." She set down her brush and turned to face me fully. "Is everything okay, Aven? You've been acting strange for the past few days." "I'm fine," I said, "just figuring some things out." But I wasn't fine, and we both knew it. I was someone whose carefully constructed world had been revealed as more fragile than I'd believed. I was someone who'd discovered that the person she'd trusted most had been systematically betraying that trust. I was someone who was finally learning the difference between being good and being used. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I went to the post office and applied for an expedited passport renewal. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, asked if I was planning a last-minute trip. "Not last minute," I said. "Just delayed." The passport photos were stark and unflattering, but I looked at them with satisfaction. This was the face of someone who was done making herself smaller to accommodate other people's expansions. This was the face of someone who was ready to protect her own dreams. That afternoon, I stopped by Meridian Art Supply to check in with my manager and pick up the watercolor paper Ezric had saved for me. The bamboo fiber felt different under my fingers, softer and more textured than the cotton paper I usually used. "It's made by a family company in Kyoto," Ezric told me. "They've been making paper the same way for 6 generations. "Maybe I'll visit them when I go there in April," I said. His smile was warm and proud. "You rescheduled?" "Cherry blossom season," I confirmed. Better timing anyway. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself, something I rarely did when Seliah was staying with us, since she always took over the kitchen with elaborate projects that left me feeling like a guest in my own home. I made simple pasta with vegetables and ate it at the kitchen table while reading a book, enjoying the quiet and the sense of nourishing myself in a space that belonged to me. Seliah came home around 9, carrying takeout from the Ethiopian restaurant, down the street and chattering about her day at the gallery. "I think I really nailed the portfolio," she said, unpacking containers of injera and lentils. The gallery owner loved my artist statement, and she said the Borrowed Light series has exactly the kind of conceptual depth they're looking for. Borrowed light. The phrase still made me feel sick. "That's great," I said, closing my book. "Actually, I have something for you." I handed her the envelope with her name on it. She took it with a puzzled expression, turning it over in her hands. "What's this?" "Something I should have given you a long time ago," I said. "I'm going to my room while you read it. When you're ready to talk, let me know." I left her sitting at the kitchen table with the envelope and went to my room, where I sat on my mattress and listened to the sounds of paper tearing and unfolding. Then silence. Long, heavy silence that stretched for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, I heard footsteps approaching my door and a soft knock. "Aven, can we talk?" I opened the door to find Seliah standing in the hallway, my letter in her hands and an expression I'd never seen before on her face. Not anger or defiance or manipulation, but something that looked almost like shame. "I need you to know," she said quietly, "that I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," I said. "And more importantly, you were willing to. I was going to pay you back. After the show, after I got established, I was going to make sure you could take an even better trip. It was such a perfect example of how Seliah operated, taking what she needed in the present and making promises about the future that would absolve her of responsibility, always planning to make amends later, after she'd gotten what she wanted. With what money? I asked. "The money you used to book my trip, that you could have used to find your own apartment?" Her face crumpled slightly. "You don't understand how hard it is to be me, to always be struggling, always having to start over, always feeling like everyone else has something I can't reach. So you decided to take mine." We stood facing each other in my doorway, and I saw something shift in her expression. The tears that had been gathering in her eyes disappeared, replaced by something harder. "You act like this trip is life or death," she said. "It's a vacation, Aven. There will be other cherry blossom seasons, other opportunities to travel. But this gallery show could change everything for me. Then use your own money and your own passport and make your own plans. It's too late for that. The trip is tomorrow." "I know," I said. "Which is why I called the airline this morning and reported fraudulent use of my passport information. Security will be waiting for you at the gate." The color drained from her face. "You didn't." "I did. Cancel the trip, Seliah. Tonight. Or face the consequences tomorrow." For a moment, we stared at each other across a chasm that felt wider than the 5 years between us. Wider than all the shared history and family loyalty and complicated love that had bound us together. Then Seliah turned and walked back to the living room, leaving me standing in my doorway with the knowledge that I'd finally learned to say no. The phone call came at 6:30 the next morning, while I was getting ready for what I knew would be a difficult day. Seliah's name flashed on my screen, and for a moment, I considered not answering, but curiosity won over self-preservation. "They wouldn't let me board," she said without preamble, her voice thick with tears and something that might have been genuine shock. Airport security pulled me aside and said there was a fraud alert on the passport information. I sat down heavily on my bed, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness that surprised me with its intensity. "I told you I would report it if you didn't cancel. I thought you were bluffing. I thought you'd never actually follow through." The admission hung between us, revealing so much about how she'd learned to see me over the years. As someone who made threats she didn't mean, who set boundaries she wouldn't enforce, who could be counted on to back down when things got serious. "Where are you now?" I asked. "Still at the airport. They kept me for 2 hours, asking questions about identity theft and fraudulent travel documents. Aven, they treated me like a criminal. You used my passport information without permission to book international travel." "That is criminal. But I'm your sister." "Which makes it worse, not better." I heard her take a shaky breath. "I don't understand how you could do this to family." The phrase hit me like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so perfectly wrong. How I could do this to family, after she'd stolen my carefully planned trip, used my identity, lied to my face for weeks while accepting my hospitality. "Seliah," I said quietly, "I need you to really think about what you just said." "What do you mean?" "You stole from me. You used my passport, my name, my money. It wasn't your money, I paid for it myself. With money you could have used to find your own apartment instead of living on my couch for over a month. You planned this while I was feeding you and giving you a place to stay. You copied my itinerary, my hotel reservations, even my reasons for why the trip mattered. And when I confronted you about it, you told me there would be other opportunities for me, but this was crucial for you. Silence on the other end of the line. And now, I continued, when I finally stood up for myself and protected something that was mine, you want to know how I could do this to family? I needed this trip, Aven. I needed something good to happen to me. So did I. That's why I saved for 2 years. I heard her crying then, the kind of tears that sounded more frustrated than remorseful. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I can't go back to Marcus's place. I can't afford a deposit on a new apartment. And now I don't even have the trip. The old me would have rushed to fix this problem, would have started brainstorming solutions and offering resources. But I was learning to recognize the difference between someone asking for help and someone expecting to be rescued from the consequences of their own choices. You'll figure it out, I said. You always do. That's it? That's all you're going to say? What would you like me to say? I'd like you to help me. I'd like you to act like my sister instead of some stranger who's decided to make my life harder. There it was, the fundamental difference in how we saw family relationships. To Seliah, being sisters meant I was obligated to prioritize her needs over my own, to absorb the impact of her choices, to provide solutions for problems she created. To me, being sisters was supposed to mean mutual care and respect, reciprocal support, love that didn't require erasure. I am acting like your sister, I said. I'm acting like someone who loves you enough to stop enabling behavior that's hurting. Both of us. Enabling? I'm not an addict, Aven. I'm just someone who's had some bad luck and needed help. For how long? How long have you needed help? How many apartments? How many boyfriends? How many crises? How many times have I dropped everything? To rescue you from situations you created? She was quiet for a moment, and I wondered if she was actually considering the question or just waiting for me to stop talking so she could redirect the conversation back to her immediate needs. I never asked you to do those things, she said. Finally, you didn't have to ask. You just assumed I would. Because you're my sister. Exactly. I'm your sister, not your emergency fund. I'm your sister, not your emotional support system. I'm your sister, not your backup plan for when your choices don't work out. I heard her take a sharp breath. So what? You're just done with me? One mistake, and you're cutting me off? This wasn't one mistake, Seliah. This was a pattern that culminated in you stealing something I'd worked 2 years to build. And I'm not cutting you off. I'm setting boundaries that should have existed all along. What does that mean? It means you need to find somewhere else to stay. It means I won't be covering your emergencies anymore. It means our relationship needs to be based on mutual respect, instead of me giving until it hurts, and you taking until you're satisfied. I can't believe you're doing this. I can't believe it took me this long. We ended the call without resolution, without apology, without the careful reconciliation that had always marked the end of our conflicts. For the first time in my adult life, I hung up the phone without trying to fix things between us. I called into both jobs again, knowing I needed one more day to process what had happened and figure out what came next. Then I called Leorin, who was on their way to work, but made time to listen to the whole story. How do you feel? They asked when I finished. Terrible and relieved at the same time, I said. Like I just survived surgery. That's probably accurate. You just cut something out that was growing in the wrong place. That afternoon, I went back to the travel agency where I'd done my original research for the Japan trip. The same agent who'd helped me plan the itinerary greeted me with surprise. I thought you were traveling this week, she said. Change of plans, I said. I need to book for April instead. She pulled up my file, and we went through the options for cherry blossom season. The flights were more expensive, the hotels more crowded, but somehow that felt appropriate. This trip would cost me more, not just financially, but emotionally. I was paying for it with the end of a relationship that had defined most of my adult life. But I was also paying for it with something else, the knowledge that I could advocate for myself, that I could say no to people I loved, that I could choose my own needs without having to justify that choice to anyone else. The ryokan you originally chose is still available, the agent told me. They had a cancellation for the first week of April. Perfect, I said, handing over my debit card. The transaction went through smoothly. No fraud alerts, no complications. Just my name on my ticket for my trip funded by my savings. When she handed me the confirmation, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The pure satisfaction of protecting something that mattered to me. That evening, Ezric came over with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and a small wrapped package. "Celebration dinner?" he asked when I opened the door. "What are we celebrating?" "You choosing yourself for once." The package contained a small sketchbook with handmade paper, the kind used by traditional Japanese artists. Inside the cover, he'd written, "For capturing moments that belong entirely to you." We ate on my fire escape, looking out over southeast Portland while I told him about the phone call with Seliah and the trip I'd rebooked. "Do you think she'll forgive you?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "And I'm learning that's not my responsibility anyway." "What is your responsibility?" I thought about it while we watched the sunset paint the sky above the neighborhood where I'd learned to live for myself, instead of through other people. To be honest about what I need. To respect my own boundaries even when other people don't. To remember that love doesn't require erasure. And to take that trip to Japan? And to take that trip to Japan. When Ezric left that night, he kissed me goodbye. Our first kiss. Soft and deliberate, and full of possibility. Standing in my doorway, I realized that this was what it felt like to be chosen by someone who wanted to see me whole, rather than useful. Seliah never came back to the apartment to get her things. She sent Leorin a text asking them to pack her belongings and leave them with a mutual friend. No apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Just one more crisis to be managed by someone else. But I wasn't managing it anymore. I was packing for a trip to Japan, where I would sit in gardens designed for contemplation and fill a sketchbook with moments that belonged entirely to me. The plane ticket was tucked safely in my passport folder. My name, my destination, my choice. To finally put myself first. The cherry blossom is still pressed between pages of the sketchbook Ezric gave me. A pale pink reminder of the morning I sat in the garden of Kiyomizu-dera Temple, and finally understood what it meant to choose myself. 6 months have passed since I returned from Japan, and the pressed flower has faded but not disappeared, just like the old patterns with Seliah that I thought would define me forever. I went to Kyoto in April, during the brief window when the sakura bloomed across the city like a promise that beautiful things could be worth waiting for. The ryokan was exactly as I'd imagined. Traditional tatami rooms, sliding paper doors, and a garden where centuries of travelers had come seeking peace. I spent 3 weeks walking through bamboo groves, visiting temples, and filling the sketchbook with watercolor studies of light moving through ancient spaces. But the most important thing I did in Japan was have conversations with myself without interruption. For the first time in my adult life, I woke up each morning with no one else's needs to consider. No one else's crisis to absorb. No one else's emotions to manage. Just my own curiosity about what lay around the next corner, what the light would look like in a different temple garden, what stories I might discover if I listened only to my own voice. I learned that I actually liked my own company. I learned that I had opinions about things I'd never been asked to have opinions about. I learned that I could make decisions based entirely on what interested me, without calculating how those decisions would affect anyone else's emotional state. I also learned that setting boundaries with family doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a whole person. Seliah and I didn't speak for 4 months after the airport incident. Radio silence that felt both painful and necessary, like the quiet after surgery while everything heals. I heard updates through mutual friends. She'd found a new apartment, started dating someone new, gotten accepted into the gallery show she'd been working toward. Her life had continued just fine without my constant availability to absorb her emergencies. When she finally called, it was late July, and I was in my room organizing the watercolors I'd brought back from Japan. Her voice sounded different, smaller, less certain of its reception. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began without preamble. "About patterns and boundaries and what it means to be sisters." "Okay," I said, not rushing to fill the silence or make the conversation easier for her. "I talked to a therapist about what happened with the trip, about why I thought it was okay to take something you'd saved for, why I felt entitled to it just because I needed it more." This was new. Seliah voluntarily seeking professional help instead of using family members as her emotional processing system. "What did you learn?" I asked. "That I've been treating your love like a resource I could harvest whenever I needed it. That I never learned to distinguish between accepting help and exploiting kindness." She paused, and I heard her take a shaky breath. "That I've been a terrible sister to someone who deserved better." I felt tears prick my eyes, not because the apology fixed everything, but because it was the first time she'd acknowledged the full scope of what had been broken between us. "I don't know how to be different," she continued. "I don't know how to have relationships that aren't based on crisis and rescue. But I want to learn, if you're willing to let me try." We talked for an hour, carefully and honestly, about the patterns we'd inherited from our childhood and the different ways we'd learned to navigate a world that often felt unstable. Seliah had learned to take what she needed when she could get it, to treat relationships as resources to be managed rather than connections to be nurtured. I had learned to give until it hurt, to measure my worth by how useful I could be to other people's emergencies. Both strategies had made sense when we were children trying to survive our parents' divorce and the emotional chaos that followed. But we weren't children anymore, and the strategies that had once protected us were now preventing us from having the adult relationship we both actually wanted. "I'm proud of you for going to Japan," she said before we hung up. "And I'm sorry. It took me stealing your trip to realize how little I'd been supporting your dreams." "Thank you," I said. "And Seliah, I'm proud of you for getting help." We didn't fix everything in that conversation, but we started the slow work of building something new. Seliah began coming to family dinners again, but now she asked about my life instead of just updating everyone on her latest crisis. She remembered details about my work at the art store, asked follow-up questions about my relationship with Ezric, expressed genuine interest in the watercolor techniques I'd learned in Japan. Most importantly, she stopped calling me with emergencies. When her car broke down, she dealt with it herself. When she had a conflict with her roommate, she worked it out directly instead of spending hours processing it with me. When she needed someone to listen to her relationship concerns, she called her therapist first and her friends second. It was strange at first, having a sister who didn't need constant rescue. I found myself almost missing the drama, the sense of purpose that came from being indispensable to someone else's survival. But gradually, I began to appreciate the relief of loving someone without feeling responsible for their happiness. Ezric and I started dating officially in May, after I returned from Japan with stories and sketches and a new confidence in my own worth. He'd waited patiently while I figured out how to have a relationship based on mutual interest rather than utility, how to be chosen for who I was rather than what I could provide. "You're different since the trip," he observed one evening when we were cooking dinner together in my kitchen. The same kitchen where I'd discovered Seliah's betrayal, now reclaimed as a space where I nourished myself and the people I chose to love. "How?" I asked. "You take up your full amount of space now. You don't apologize for having opinions or preferences. You don't shrink yourself to make room for other people's expansion." It was true. The trip to Japan had taught me something essential about the difference between being alone and being lonely, between solitude and isolation. I'd learned that I could be complete without being useful, that I could be loved without being needed, that I could choose my own adventures without having to justify those choices to anyone else. The pressed cherry blossom in my sketchbook is more than a souvenir. It's evidence that some dreams are worth fighting for, that setting boundaries doesn't make you selfish, that choosing yourself is not the same as abandoning the people you love. Leorin framed one of my Japan watercolors and hung it in the coffee shop where they work. Customers often ask about it, drawn to the way the light moves through the bamboo forest I painted during my second week in Kyoto. Sometimes I go there to work on new pieces, surrounded by the comfortable noise of people choosing to spend time together rather than being obligated to fix each other's problems. I still work both jobs, but now the money I earn goes toward my own goals. A better easel, higher quality paints, perhaps another trip next year. The mason jar on my windowsill is filling up again, but this time it's labeled Next Adventure instead of Japan Fund. This time, I'm saving not to escape my life, but to expand it. Last week, I got a text from Seliah with a photo of a painting she'd completed, part of a new series about family relationships and the difference between love and obligation. The painting showed two figures sharing something between them, but unlike her previous work, both figures were clearly visible, neither one fading into the background to make room for the other. "Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't require erasure," her message said. "I couldn't have painted this without learning what you tried to tell me." I texted back a heart emoji and a photo of my latest watercolor, a garden scene where every flower was distinct and fully bloomed, where nothing was sacrificed to make room for something else. We're learning, slowly and carefully, how to be sisters, without being satellites of each other's needs. We're learning that family can mean mutual support, rather than one-sided rescue. We're learning that love is not a zero-sum game where someone has to lose for someone else to win. The cherry blossom in my sketchbook has faded to the color of old photographs, but its meaning has only grown clearer with time. It reminds me of the morning I sat in a garden on the other side of the world and realized that I was finally having conversations with myself without interruption. It reminds me that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is choose your own life, protect your own dreams, and trust that the people who really love you will want to see you whole rather than just helpful. Some dreams are worth fighting for. Some boundaries are worth setting. Some relationships are worth the hard work of rebuilding from scratch. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for family is teach them that your love is not a resource to be harvested. It's a choice. To be honored. The pressed cherry blossom is proof that I finally learned to honor my own choices, and in doing so, I created space for the people I love to honor theirs. There's a strange kind of silence that follows emotional noise, like the ringing in your ears after a concert or the hush that falls after a thunderstorm. When I came back from Japan, my world was wrapped in that kind of quiet. Not peace exactly, but the aftermath of something loud and relentless finally ending. The apartment was cleaner than I remembered. Maybe it was just that my eyes had changed. After 3 weeks of polished wood floors and gardens that obeyed centuries-old design principles, everything in Portland seemed clumsy and loud. Even the way I moved through my own home felt unfamiliar, like someone rearranged the furniture of my life while I was gone, even though I knew it had been me all along. Leorin had left a note on the kitchen table. "Welcome back. I saved the last zine for you. Page 14 might look familiar. L." I unfolded the latest issue of Soft Revolt, their monthly print of art, essays, and resistance in lowercase fonts and delicate collage. Page 14 was a black and white scan of a watercolor, mine. The bamboo grove outside the philosopher's path. The caption below read, "The things we protect become part of us. Aven Delora, Kyoto, 2025. I hadn't even realized Leorin had taken a photo of that page in my sketchbook. I sat at the table, jet-lagged and hollow, and stared at the painting for what felt like hours. It was mine. Not just because I'd painted it, but because I'd fought for the right to. That fact felt distant, but solid, like the ground after a long flight. The next morning, I wandered into Meridian Art Supply like a ghost returning to the living. Ezric looked up from the counter, where he was labeling a new shipment of oil pastels. "You're back," he said, his eyes softening as he stepped out from behind the counter. He didn't rush toward me, didn't say anything else. Just let the silence fill the space between us until I decided what to do with it. "I brought you something," I said, reaching into my bag and pulling out a package wrapped in soft washi paper. Inside was a set of handmade brushes from Nara, handles carved from cherry wood, bristles so fine they looked like strands of eye. Silk Ezric took the package slowly, as if it might vanish. "These are beautiful. They reminded me of how you hold things," I said. "Carefully, like they might break and still be worth loving." He didn't say anything for a while, and neither did I. When the silence became too wide to stand in, I added, "I don't know where we left things before I left, or what we're calling this now." He met my eyes. "We don't have to name it yet. We can just keep choosing it, one day at a time." It was the exact kind of answer that would have terrified me before the trip. But now, it felt like the kind of slowness I could believe in. The truth is, coming home didn't feel like returning. It felt like transplanting a tree whose roots had started growing somewhere else. I wasn't sure what would survive the shift. I wandered through familiar rooms like a tourist in my own life. The coffee mugs, the creaky floorboard in the hall, the chipped enamel kettle, all of it looked slightly displaced, like an imitation of the life I'd left behind. Celia's things were gone, but not forgotten. Her scent still clung to the couch cushions. Her ghost still moved through the apartment in the late afternoons when sunlight caught the corners of the living room. I found one of her earrings wedged between couch cushions a week after my return. A small gold hoop with a turquoise bead, the kind she used to wear when she was trying to look earthy but still iconic. I held it in my palm for a long time, unsure whether I wanted to keep it or throw it out. Eventually, I left it on the kitchen counter, where it sat for 3 days before disappearing. Leorin never asked about it, and I never mentioned it. Some losses don't need announcements. I started painting again in small increments, not because I felt inspired, but because it was how I remembered who I was. 20 minutes a day at first, then an hour, then 2. I painted from memory, temple roofs at sunrise, the curve of a bridge over still water, the shadow of a monk walking through a stone corridor. But the work didn't feel like it used to. It wasn't about escaping anymore. It was about occupying space, silence, selfhood. I wasn't painting to hide. I was painting to stay. I submitted a piece to a small gallery downtown, just to see what would happen. They wrote back a week later. "We'd love to feature your Kyoto series in our spring show." The email felt surreal. I reread it 4 times before calling Leorin. They answered on the second ring. "What's up?" I got in. "The gallery show. They're taking the Kyoto paintings." A pause. Then, "Of course they are. You're finally letting people see you." Seliah didn't reach out. Not after the flight. Not after the confrontation. Not even after I returned from the trip I'd reclaimed as mine. In a way, I'd expected it. Not because she didn't care, but because shame, for Seliah, was like a tidal wave. She either let it drown her, or she ran in the opposite direction. Still, some nights I stared at my phone, scrolling through old text threads, photos of us in our happier moments, holding wine glasses at her first art show, laughing in thrift stores, her arms around me in that lopsided way she always hugged. I kept thinking, there must be a way back to that, but I didn't know if it would be the same road or a completely different one. One night, around 2 a.m, I opened a blank text message to her. I wrote, "I'm back. I saw the blossoms." Then I stared at it for a long time. I didn't send it. Instead, I deleted the message and went to my sketchbook. I painted the view from my ryokan window, the morning fog settling over the garden, the way the light filtered through the cedar branches. I titled it, Still yours, still mine. It was enough. For now. A month after my return, I stood in the center of the gallery at the opening of my first show. People wandered past my paintings, wine in hand, murmuring about color and stillness and space. I stood next to Ezric, who looked more nervous than I did. "Why are you fidgeting?" I asked, bumping his shoulder. "I've just never seen people react to your work before. It's like watching strangers read your diary." It kind of is. A woman stopped in front of the centerpiece, my rendering of Kiyomizu-dera's veranda at twilight. She turned to me and said, "This feels like something you'd paint if you'd been through a quiet heartbreak." I blinked. "I did." She smiled. "Then you brought that silence with you beautifully." Ezric squeezed my hand. "Told you." After the show, Lyron found me at the back of the gallery near the snack table, loading my plate with too many grapes out of nerves. "You look like you're waiting to be told this was all a mistake," they said gently. "Is it that obvious?" They shrugged. "You're a creature of usefulness, Aven. It's strange to be celebrated when you're used to being used." I laughed. Poetic and depressing. Accurate, though. They leaned in, voice dropping. "I've been meaning to tell you, page 14 was the most shared scan we've ever had. I got emails about it. People saw themselves in that grove. Something caught in my throat. Thank you for seeing me first." "You saw yourself first," they corrected. "You just let me look too." On the day I officially took Seliah's name off the lease, I felt something unspool in my chest. Not joy, not grief, something quieter, like I was finally making space for roots of my own. I didn't realize how much of my life had been background noise until I sat in my room one afternoon and noticed the silence. No Seliah on the phone dissecting a relationship. No late-night Netflix marathon echoing from the living room. No impromptu vocal warm-ups before she reclaimed her voice. Just me, the hum of the fridge, and the soft scratch of a pencil over bamboo paper. I used to fear this kind of quiet. It felt like failure. Like I'd done something wrong if no one needed me, no one called, no one pulled my attention away from myself. But now, quiet felt like possibility, like a language I was just beginning to understand. That week, I found a routine again. Not a desperate rhythm of survival, but something steady and spacious. I opened the art store 4 mornings a week, stayed late on Thursdays to manage inventory. I painted in the afternoons. Ezric came over most evenings. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. The silence between us wasn't tense. It was shared. One night, after we'd been sitting on my fire escape watching the city turn itself off window by window, he said, "You don't flinch when it gets quiet anymore." I used to. All the time. It was like you were waiting for the next disaster. I considered that. Maybe I was. Or maybe I was just afraid that if everything stopped, I'd hear something I didn't want to. And now? I smiled. Now I'm learning to listen. The message from Seliah came in the middle of a Thursday shift. "Hi, Aven. If you're open to it, I'd like to see you." No expectations. Just coffee. Just whatever you're ready for. My stomach tightened like it was trying to rewind 6 months of distance in one breath. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I reread the message. Twice. 3 times. The surprising part wasn't that she'd reached out. It was the tone. No drama. No emotional grandstanding. Just a question, gently offered. I waited until my shift was over before responding. "Okay. Next week, Sunday afternoon, let's meet somewhere public." We met at a quiet corner cafe in Selwood, the kind with crooked wooden floors and mismatched chairs. I got there early and took the seat by the window. Seliah walked in wearing a loose linen jumpsuit and no makeup, unusual for her. Her hair was tied back simply. She looked older than I remembered. Or maybe just more grounded. "Hi," she said, voice cautious. "Thanks for agreeing to this." "Hi." We sat. Awkward silence settled between us, thick but not angry. More, like two people adjusting to an old habit that didn't fit anymore. "I rehearsed a whole speech," she admitted after we ordered. "But I left it at home, on purpose. Probably for the best." She nodded, lips pressing together. Then, "I'm sorry, Aven. Not just for the trip, for all of it." I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't believe her, but because I needed to decide what I was ready to carry and what I needed to leave behind. "Thank you," I said finally. I needed to hear that. I wasn't ready to face how much I'd leaned on you. I didn't want to believe I'd become someone who takes more than they give. You've always been someone who gives a lot. To your art, to your friends. But with me, it got unbalanced. For years. I know. She looked away. I'm trying to understand why I let it happen. Why I expected you to be my safety net instead of my sister. The server dropped off our drinks. We each took a long sip, like we were fortifying ourselves for something delicate. "I'm not the same person I was before that trip," I said. "And I don't think we can go back to who we were before. But maybe we can try something new." "Something quieter," she said, and I knew she meant it in more ways than one. That night, I told Lyoran about the meeting while we sat cross-legged on their living room floor, organizing print layouts for the next soft revolt. "She didn't cry?" they asked, stapling a mini-zine. "Nope, not even once. It was weirdly calm. Growth is uncomfortable, like emotionally exfoliating." I laughed. "That's disgusting." But accurate. I picked up a proof copy and flipped through the pages. My next watercolor series, sketches of abandoned spaces reclaiming themselves with moss and wildflowers, was scheduled for the April issue. "You're writing something to go with these, right?" they asked. "Maybe." People want your story, Aven, not just the art. They want the reason behind it. What if I'm not ready to tell it yet? Then start with what you are ready to say. A week later, I sent in my first essay for publication. It wasn't about Seliah. Not directly. It was about moss growing on forgotten stone walls. About what happens when silence gets a chance to stay. About beauty that doesn't beg to be witnessed. I called it Learning the Language of Quiet. Ezric read it first. "This feels like your voice," he said. "Not the one you used when you were trying to explain yourself. The one you use when you're finally just saying what's true. Was it too quiet?" "No," he said. "It was finally loud enough to hear. My mother called after the piece was published. 'I read your thing in the magazine,' she said. 'That moss line, that's really something.'" I held the phone, tightly. "Thanks. You know, when your father and I split up, I thought I was doing you both a favor by teaching you how to take care of each other. But maybe I just taught you how to disappear. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was close. I learned how to come back," I said. "I'm proud of you," she replied, and this time, I believed her. One evening, after we'd eaten dinner, and were lying in my room watching the ceiling fan spin, Ezric turned to me. "I've been thinking of applying for a summer program in Vermont. It's for printmakers. 2 months. Very remote. No cell service." "Wow," I said, surprised but not unhappy. "Sounds like exactly your kind of weird." He smiled. "Would you be okay if I went?" I rolled over to face him. "Would you be okay if I said yes?" "I think so, if you visit." I thought about it. About what space meant now. About the fact that our relationship wasn't built on fear of loss, but faith in growth. "I'll send you care packages," I said, "with terrible poetry and postcards I paint just for you." Deal. In March, I was invited to do a live reading of my essay at a local arts event. It was the first time I'd read my words aloud in public. Seliah showed up, quietly and without fanfare. She stood in the back, wearing the same linen jumpsuit from our cafe meeting. After the reading, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a painting, 2 chairs facing each other across a table, one with a steaming cup of tea, the other with a sketchbook. On the back she'd written, "Not everything has to be loud taboo. Matter. Love, S." I framed it, and next to it I hung a new piece I'd just finished, a watercolor of my kitchen table, empty and full of light. I titled it, "A Room That Doesn't Need Saving." There's a kind of light that only shows up after a long season of shadow. Not blinding, not dramatic, just steady. Reluctant at first, like it wants to make sure it's safe before it stays. That's how things felt between me and Seliah that spring. We weren't healed, we weren't back, but we were steady. She invited me to a group show in a warehouse gallery on the east side. Her series was called Between the Echoes, mostly abstract canvases in layered oils, blues and charcoal grays with slashes of copper. Each piece looked like it had been scraped away from silence. I stood in front of one called After the Voice Breaks and felt a quiet pull at my chest. Beneath the top layer of paint, there were ghost shapes, faint outlines of chairs, windows, and once, unmistakably, 2 silhouetted figures at a dinner table. "That one's about us," Seliah said, coming up beside me. "Before, and maybe after, too." I turned to look at her. She met my eyes. "I've been going to a support group, codependency recovery. It's weird, but it's helping me see how much of what I thought was love was actually control or survival." I nodded. I know the difference now, too. Between showing up for someone and sacrificing myself to keep them standing. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We just stood there, in front of the painting that had once been a rupture and now was a bridge. That week, I started therapy again. Not crisis management therapy, like I'd done in college when I couldn't stop grinding. My teeth at night, this was the slow kind. The kind where you show up and the first thing they ask is, "What do you want to explore?" And you say, "I'm afraid of wanting too much," and the therapist nods like you've just given them a map. Ezric got accepted to the Vermont program. He told me on the back steps of my apartment while we were eating slices of blood orange and watching a pair of crows argue over something shiny. "You'll come visit, right?" he asked, voice casual, but his eyes searching. "If you send me a list of obscure nature facts to quiz you on when I arrive." He smiled, relieved. "Done." "Also," I said, pulling out a thin envelope from behind me. "I applied for something too." He blinked. "You did?" I handed him the letter. It was from an artist residency in Amsterdam. 6 weeks. Mixed media focus. Garden studio space included. He read it, then looked up at me like he'd never seen me. More clearly, "You got in?" I got in. We sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then he laughed. "I guess we're both about to learn what distance actually means." I nodded. And what it doesn't. Later that week, Seliah texted me a photo of a mural in progress. 2 figures made of broken ceramic and mirror tiles. One offering a piece of light to the other. Below it, she'd captioned, "What happens when we stop borrowing light and start reflecting it back? Want to help finish it? It's a public installation for community reconciliation. They're looking for artists who've lived through relational recovery stuff." And I thought, maybe we qualify. I stared at the message longer than I needed to. Then I typed, "Yeah, let's make something together that neither of us has to carry alone." We worked on the mural for 6 weekends. Seliah handled most of the layout. Her style had always leaned cinematic. I did the intricate brushwork between tile borders and painted the line of gold that ran from one figure's heart to the other's. Volunteers came and went. Kids from the local high school helped with cleanup. A woman who'd lost her sister to addiction brought a box of clay tokens she'd made, each one etched with words like hope, break, still, return. We embedded some of them into the base of the mural like offerings. One afternoon, a man stood in front of the wall and asked quietly, "Is this about forgiveness?" I looked at him, then at the mural, then back. "It's about aftermath," I said, "and choosing what grows there." On the final day of painting, Seliah brought iced coffee in 2 envelopes. "Yours came," she said, handing me one. It was my finalized itinerary for Amsterdam. Flight confirmation, housing details, supply list. The last time I'd held a folder like this, it had nearly broken me. "Thanks," I said. She handed me the second envelope. This one was hand-painted, our 2 mural figures in miniature. Inside was a letter. Simple, honest. "Aven, I don't know if I'll ever be the sister you deserved, but I am becoming the kind of person who sees the cost of what I've taken. Thank you for giving me the chance to build something instead of borrow it. You were my mirror. I'm learning to become my own. Love, Seliah." The mural was unveiled the next week. It stood 2 stories tall in a formerly vacant lot between a battered laundromat and a Vietnamese bakery. On opening day, people from the neighborhood brought folding chairs and lemonade. The mayor gave a short speech about community healing. Local kids read poems. Seliah and I stood off to the side. "You know," she said, "for a long time I thought you were the quiet one because you didn't have anything to say. And now? Now I know you were waiting for someone to stop interrupting you." When the sun hit the mural just right, the mirror, tiles threw sparks of light across the sidewalk and into people's eyes, not in a painful way, just enough to make you look up. The morning I left for Amsterdam, the sky over Portland was lavender gray, the kind of sky that felt like a clean slate. My suitcase sat by the door like it knew it had already done this once. Been packed for a departure that nearly didn't happen. Been unpacked in grief, then packed again in something that looked more like agency than escape. I walked through the apartment slowly, one last circuit, touching the things that had remained. Sketchbooks stacked on the windowsill, the mason jar labeled Next Adventure, already gathering its first coins, the framed watercolor of my kitchen table in sunlight. On the fridge, a note from Leorin. "Some dreams are destinations. Some are departure points. Go bloom." I smiled, slipped the note into my sketchbook, and locked the door behind me. Amsterdam was a watercolor city. Even when it rained, and it often did, the canals reflected everything twice. Bicycles blurred into bridges. Flower stalls left the scent of peonies and tulips in the air long after the stands closed. My studio was part of an old garden house. Floor-to-ceiling windows, ivy creeping up the brick, the kind of light that made everything feel like it had a secret. The residency was small. 12 artists. A mix of languages, mediums, and quiet. Late-night revelations over wine and clay and charcoal. I taught a workshop on layered watercolor textures using pieces of handmade bamboo paper I'd brought from Kyoto. I didn't expect anyone to care, but they did. "You make silence visible," a sculptor from Spain told me one afternoon. "That's rare." Ezric and I sent voice memos instead of texts. There was something intimate about hearing each other's voices without the pressure of conversation. Some days we talked about nothing. His broken bike chain, my favorite pastry from the corner, bakery, a bird that kept nesting outside my studio window. Other days we talked about what we missed. "Not gonna lie," he said once. "This whole experience is a little stretching." "Like yoga or like pulled taffy?" I replied. "More like emotional taffy. But worth it." "Worth it," I echoed. That's the right word. 3 weeks in, I visited the Hortus Botanicus, one of the oldest botanical gardens in Europe. I spent hours wandering its glass houses and paths, sketching orchids and ferns and a tree from the 1600s that had survived fires, war, and storms. It looked gnarled and glorious, like it had decided to keep showing up no matter what. I painted it that night, ink and wash, titled it Still Standing. Then I wrote a letter to Seliah. Hey, there's a tree here that reminds me of us. Not because it's beautiful, but because it's endured. You were right about rebuilding. We're not what we were. But maybe what we are now has more room to breathe. Thank you for helping me reclaim my voice. Not by giving it back, but by finally listening. Love. Aven. I mailed it the next morning, along with a copy of the painting. By the final week of the residency, I'd filled 3 sketchbooks, taught 2 more workshops, and started something new. A series about windows. Not metaphorical ones. Literal ones. The way light fell through them. The shapes they cut across beds, plants, faces. I called the series Full Bloom, not because everything was perfect, but because I was finally showing up for myself fully. Back in Portland, Leorin picked me up from the airport with a cardboard sign that read, "Welcome home, Art Nun." I laughed. "I missed you." "Obviously," they said. "So, you staying?" "For now." We drove through a city that looked both the same and different. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was everything. Seliah and I had lunch the next week. Same cafe, same window seat. She brought a gift, a small print of the mural we'd worked on. This time, she'd added something new. A third figure, smaller, between the other 2, holding its own light. "I've been painting versions of us," she said, "but I'm learning not to freeze us in one frame." I nodded. "Me too." "I read your essay in Soft Revolt, by the way. The one about the moss." "Yeah. I liked the part about growth choosing its own shape." "It took a while to learn that." She looked out the window. "I'm glad you did." Ezric came back from Vermont looking sunburned and content. "You feel different," I told him. "Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm just more honest now." We sat on my floor eating ramen and comparing sketchbooks. "I'm not sure what happens next," I said. "With us. With me." "That's okay," he said. "We don't need a map, just a direction." Spring passed like a whispered secret. I showed my Full Bloom series at a pop-up gallery on Alberta Street. People came. People wept. People asked questions about windows and metaphor and light. I answered as honestly as I could. "I used to think love meant shrinking," I said during a Q&A. "Now I think it means blooming without permission." Someone clapped. On the anniversary of the Kyoto trip that wasn't, and then was, I visited the cherry blossom tree in Laurelhurst Park. It was just starting to bloom. Pale pink and defiant. I sat on a bench nearby and sketched. Not because I had to, but because it was how I remembered that I belonged to myself. A little girl walked by and asked what I was drawing. "This tree," I said. "I came to see it. Last year, too. It was different then." She squinted at the branches. "It's pretty." "Yeah," I said. "It is." She looked at my sketch. "Are you going to paint the sky behind it, too?" "I think I will." She smiled, satisfied, then ran back to her parents. Later that day, I tucked the sketch into the back of my newest notebook. On the top of the next page, I wrote, "Some stories start with betrayal, but they don't have to end there. Some sisters get lost in each other's shadows, and then learn how to grow separately. Some dreams take longer, but they bloom all the same." Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.